everything that happens in the house stays in the house. When you're being a victim, you don't realize that this is you being a victim. You're not aware of that. So I think that's the problem of the silence too.
How does cultural identity impact a Hispanic victim's journey to safety? Are there cultural messages about family, gender roles, and silence that can complicate the leaving process? Do language differences make it difficult to even communicate about abuse? And what is the effect of the generational cycle of violence on victims in the Hispanic community? This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today I'm speaking with
Lottie Ruiz, Marlena Morsdorf,
Maria Rojas.
These are all members of the Morris County Organization for Hispanic Affairs, or MCOHA for short. MCOHA is one of our partners at the JBWS-led Morris Family Justice Center, and they provide critical resources for serving victims within the Hispanic community. In this episode, they will explore how little abuse is talked about, how difficult it is to recognize abuse in the Hispanic community, and how cultural factors can complicate leaving abusive relationships. But before you listen to this episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe to Unsilenced, real conversations about abuse. It makes a huge difference in getting our message out there. Okay, here's the episode. Why is it so critically important to consider cultural identity for victims of abuse in the Hispanic community?
So it is very important because our culture is very diverse. Not every Hispanic person from different Hispanic communities are the same. So it is very important to know when you're having, for example, an intake with a client, to listen to them and see where they are coming from, what their beliefs are, what their religion, because all of that is important and it can definitely either help us to help the client or it could be a barrier for us to be able to work with them. For example, education. Some people are highly educated, so you can use terminology that they won't understand, but there are some others that didn't even go to school at all. So they could get scared just by listening to the words that you're using. So I think it's very important that we know who the specific community we are helping, because as I said, we are very diverse. I am Colombian, and one word for me means something completely different in Mexico or Honduras, for example. And it's the same word, but it means something different. So sometimes that could bring us into making mistakes or stereotype or do different type of things. So I think it's very important that we know that our identities are very different, and that way we can serve our community better.
So in your experience with working with victims, if they have a unique understanding of the word and yours is different, how have you seen that show up? Is it just in like accessing services or describing their experience of abuse, or where did you see that kind of discrepancy?
So I think for me, it's when they're describing kind of what's been going on. They'll use a term, and what I always like to do is I tell them, explain it to me like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old. Explain it to me like you're explaining it to your children. Or what does that mean? I do a lot of follow-up questions, and then I've come across where I've believed initially the term to mean something, but it actually meant something completely different. And so I think that in my experience, having an approach where you're more open as opposed to trying to draw conclusions, so that you understand where people are coming from, so that you understand what the level of education is, what their religion is, because it's not just, oh, you're Hispanic, you're this. No, there's so much that goes into so much diversity in the diversity. And so I think that having that approach again, where you're more open to just hearing people out first to try to understand where they're coming from. And like I said, all of the other factors will help you better assist them, as opposed to kind of having a stereotype, right? Or misconceptions like that could lead to barriers of you helping.
Yeah, that diversity is so important to keep in mind, because Hispanic is such a wide term that encompasses so many people. Like you can't just have one fit for everything. How might a Hispanic person's journey to safety have different complications and factors to consider than maybe somebody of another demographic or population?
When I think of journey to safety, I'm thinking about resources. I'm thinking about awareness, first of all, and then access to resources. And I think that it is a little bit different in our community because a lot of folks are just not even aware that a center like JBWS exists where they can have all of these other types of resources. A common theme that I've come across is, oh, I went through this and that in my country of origin, and I never went to the police because they weren't going to do anything. I didn't tell maybe family members because that's just how it's supposed to be, right? And so they come here and they may think, right, that it's going to be the same thing. Why am I going to report this? Why am I, right? And that there's no hope. They just don't know that it's different, that there are resources. So I think the first level is awareness, right? And then the access is then getting there, right? And so they may know, okay, let's say, for example, JBWS exists, but they may have challenges in how to get that access. How am I going to get there? Maybe the mode of transportation, maybe if they're, financially dependent on a partner and they don't even have access for a bus fare, right? Or if they're here and all their family or most of their family is back home, they don't have that support system of family members where maybe they could say, give me a ride, or I'm going to leave the kids with you while I go, and do this. And so that's where I think the journey may be a little bit different to access, resources, because that's where you're going to get to safety, right? When you're able to get connected to the resources.
I think the awareness and dedication that we have to do with our community. Some of them don't even want to hear about it, because of the stigma of domestic violence. So I'm going to be put like mark where I am saying I'm being a victim, and culturally we don't do that. We stay silent, as the name of the podcast. Exactly.
Yeah. Why do you think there is a culture of silence around domestic violence in the Hispanic community? What do you think that stigma, where does it originate from?
Well, first, I never remember hearing at home anything about domestic violence ever, or at school or anywhere in our cultures. That's not something very common, maybe nowadays, but when we were little, I never heard that word. I'm gonna be honest. So you don't even know you're being a victim of domestic violence. You don't know in your household there is domestic violence because you're not aware of that. And there is a quote that we use a lot in Spanish, which is calladita se ve más bonita, which is being in silence, you look beautiful, So, and that's a lot. It's like, even when parents were talking and you wanted to say something, they'll be like, this is not a conversation for children, So they use those words, and it's very common. And for us, it's like, it's okay. But I think when we grow up, it could also stay there with us, and that happened to our grandparents, that happened, generations. So I think that is also part of it, of that history that tell us that we have to be quiet, because this is the way you keep things inside your house. You don't take everything that happens in the house, it stays in the house, not inside. So you don't tell your friends. So I guess when you're being a victim, you don't realize that this is you being a victim. You're not aware of that. So I think that's the problem of the silence too.
That is a spectacular point. I think you're right. A lot of people don't recognize that they're being victimized. And that is, as you pointed out, the purpose of the podcast is that so many people are living with abuse right now, and they might not even realize it, whether that's because it's been acceptable to them or they haven't been taught to challenge it or even think about it. And there's just a lot of research that speaks to the importance of family in the Hispanic community. The National Domestic Violence Hotline notes, many people believe the family is more important than the safety and comfort of one person, even if they are experiencing abuse. Do you find this to be true? How do family values impact the recognition and normalization of abuse?
Family has a lot to do, because I have heard women saying like, oh, I told my mother that I was going through this, and she told me like, it's okay, he's paying for the bills. He's a good father. So it's okay. I went through the same thing with your father, or grandma did the same. And it was fine. I'm here, nothing happened to me. I'm alive. So yeah, so then you feel like, oh my God, I'm doing something wrong. Or it's like, oh, no. Family is going to know about this. Everybody's going to find out that you're going through this, so you shouldn't, because the family is going to look bad. So that happens a lot. And that it's a really big weight because it's like I don't want my family to be disappointed because as you said, for us, family means everything. Like everything is around family. So when you have that challenge of having to go because you're going against not just the person who's the perpetrator or
Mm-hmm.
but you're going against your family and probably his family. I mean, talking of course in terms of women because
Right.
that's the community that I serve, but you're going against also to against his family that has already become my family. So that's hard. And I can understand. And when you don't have the education, you're not aware of what this is going on, but someone is telling you, listen, this is domestic violence. This is what could happen. So you can get help. And I'm like, you have to come and face all these barriers, not just with the system, the barriers in general, but with your own feelings, the guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I think that's definitely one of the biggest issues.
I want to piggyback off of what Maria said, just briefly, just the feelings of guilt of what the consequences would be to someone who's the father of the children, especially.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? What do you mean?
I think what I notice is that if someone's going to be willing to testify against their abuser, one thing that's weighing on their mind is whether that person will be in jail and what will they tell their children and how he got there. Which if they're growing up here, they see something different than maybe what their parents grew up with.
It really comes down to the person feeling, right? Like the world is in their hands, right? Like my life, my world, my family is in my hands, right? And so as Maria was saying, you're disappointing family members, your abuelita, your grandmother telling you,
Yeah.
this is normal, this is fine. Like, I've had personally my grandma say, it's better to be mejor lo malo conocido que lo bueno por conocer. It's better to be with the bad you know than the good unknown. Right?
Wow.
So I can relate to this with this mindset, right? And so this person is faced, like, think about how you could feel. You're faced with having to make a decision whether you're speaking up for yourself or you're quote unquote keeping the peace, right? By not. And so if you do, it's kind of a selfish decision. And the consequences of that are separation of the family, potential jail time or deportation of your partner, and having to face that and having to face your family and your children later asking you why. It's very, very difficult when victims do actually speak up and make that decision. I think it's tremendous. It's
the bravest.
It's extremely brave. And I don't think people actually understand the magnitude of that.
I can't even imagine being a victim of abuse, going up against, in your mind, your partner and your family and maybe their family. And can you just speak like what do you think that would take, like a victim to really kind of be able to look at their family and say, this is happening? Like, what would that feel like for a victim of abuse?
I think in my experience, from what I've seen in my conversations with people that are encountering these types of abuse, is when they're able to make the connection that it's not because, okay, so they're faced with the decision, right? And it's like, okay, I have to do this for myself. And it's considered quote unquote selfish, right?
Right.
But when they make the connection that it also affects their children, that if they are affected themselves, they are not, it's trickling down to everyone else in the family, and they see it, they're able to, like, it's like a relief, like, I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for my family. When there's that connection, that's where you see the decisions, and it makes it easier for them, but it's still extremely difficult.
But I also feel that's still in line with the allegiance almost to family of like, well, I'm doing this for my child, so you're still honoring your family in a way. It's just kind of honoring it from like descendants instead of ancestors, you know what I mean? Which is an interesting.
You just said something very important. It's like yeah, I'm doing this for my child too. So it's
Mhm.
really hard that we do it for ourselves. That I said I'm gonna do
Yeah.
this because of me, you know?
Yeah.
So that's really hard because we are always looking into being improve somebody else. We are not that like self-love.
Mm.
You know, we're not that type of community that tells women to empower themselves. You know, as again, I'm saying this is the way it used to be. I think it has changed a lot. And when I see those younger generations doing those wonderful things, those women speaking up and everything, I'm like, oh my God, I wish I was
Right.
20 right now and I'm rallying and all of this, you
Right.
know? Because it's like, how I didn't know this when I was this young, you know? I
Mm.
would have helped so many other women or people in
Mm.
general, because again, this doesn't happen just to women.
Right.
It just happens that this is the community I work with or the population. But it's, yeah, what it makes me feel that I can do this, that I could be brave enough to go
Mm.
ahead and say. And right now, it's also that there is a lot of information out there on social media, you know, on TV. So many more people are now saying, like, I need to heal in a certain way. And
Yes.
when you realize that healing also means cutting the
Mm.
transgenerational trauma, it's like, oh my
Mm.
God, maybe I have to do this so it doesn't happen anymore in my family, you know? So it
Wow.
doesn't happen to anybody else. Because right now it's a lot of awareness of that. So I have heard a lot of women come into my office and say, listen, I don't want this to happen anymore to my family. I'm gonna do it for my
Mm.
grandma. I'm gonna do it for my future kids, you know, or I
Wow.
have kids and I don't want my kids to do it. Or my kids told me, Mom, what is happening is domestic violence, you know?
Wow.
So it's like, oh, my kids told me, or we leave this place, or we
Yeah.
finish this, or well, I'm gonna kill that, you know, things like those. So it's
Yeah.
like you're at the end, you're always trying to do it for somebody else, not
Mhm.
for yourself, you know? And
Mm.
um and that's beautiful because that's part of love, you know?
Yeah.
And love is the center of everything for us.
Mm.
But for your family, for your children, your parents, you know? So
Wow.
I think when you realize that that's not love, you know, like
Mm.
staying in the situation is when you
Mm.
said, oh my God, I have to get it out of here. I have to change this.
Yeah.
And that's when it happens. The change happened.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that you say this because why do you think there's such a conditioning maybe to not think about your needs and your wants? You talked a little bit about selfishness, about guilt maybe, but what do you think is starting to shift that kind of narrative towards it's okay to think about myself? Or what would you want to convey to somebody who does think it's selfish to think about themselves in this situation? Because you just mentioned a lot about love. Love is the cornerstone of your work. And it's okay to love yourself as well and want better for yourself and want safety for yourself, just solely for yourself and no other reason.
It is access to seeing something different in your community.
Mm.
Because if that's all you've been taught and that's all you know, you're not going to see something different. And as Maria was saying, there's more
Yeah.
social media that's coming up with encouragement
Mm.
to value yourself or to think of your self-worth in a different way.
In my experience, I don't think I was really ever taught to love myself.
Mm.
You know, when I think about, you know, courses that you should have in elementary school or high school, I'm like, okay, there should be like a tax course in there because we're always going to have to do taxes,
Yeah.
right? But there should also be a class on loving yourself, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why it's really not it's not given the importance that it needs because
Mm.
however way you look at life, right? Whether you're quote unquote again, quote unquote selfish and you want to think about yourself, it starts with loving yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you want to be in service to others, which in our profession, that's what we do. We're in service to others.
Mm-hmm.
We have to love ourselves first. It's the same answer. We have to love ourselves first because we need to be okay first in order to be able to help others. And
Right.
that includes in our profession, in our families.
You know, you said something really interesting, and I'm kind of wondering if this is also something that's unique sometimes, and I'm stereotyping, but to women, where we're conditioned kind of not to put ourselves first or to think about things in a different realm just because of our gender. And so I'm wondering Do you think certain gender role expectations play into a victim's decision or reluctance to leave their partner? Does that play a role, do you think?
Yes, I think it has a lot to do with that because you have children, then you have to be the one who cares for the children too. So if you have a job, you have to have a part-time job usually because if they are little, it's hard for you to, and if you have more than one child, if you don't have any family members around to help out. So then definitely that's a hardship. And men are the one who are the providers. So if they're the providers, of course they feel like they have the power, you know. So if I made the decision to go forward into getting help, what's going to happen? Are the children going to be taken away? Am I going to be able to support myself? And this is the every time I have someone coming to the office, that's the first thing they say, I can't support myself economically by myself because it's very
Wow.
expensive, you know. That's one of the things also that rent is very expensive in our areas. So for a single mom with no like let's say many of them undocumented, so they don't get paid any higher rates, no any education. So definitely that's gonna be for me. I'm like, do I really want to do this or do I stay where I'm gonna have stability economically, you know?
Right.
And then also when it is on the other side, when it comes to men being the victims, it's like also, you know, like I'm the supporter. If I leave this, then what's gonna happen to her, you know, and to the kids? Or
Interesting.
I'm gonna look like I'm weak because
Yeah.
I let my partner do this to me. It depends because again, as we said, our cultures, and I think it's still it doesn't matter that we are in a different century in our back in our countries, and we bring that from you know from our countries. That's the culture that we were raised in. We still think and see the man as the figure of power, you know, and you know, and they are, and so it's hard for them too because they have to represent that figure. But for us women, it's hard because it's like I have to respect what the man wants or says, you know. So I think that's in gender, that's one. It also it's really hard in order to go ahead and say, I need help. I need, you know, to get out of this situation.
This conversation is actually reminding me of one of the questions that a community member submitted, which is basically revolves around machismo. So, do you think male victims of abuse are reluctant to come forward because of that notion? Or do you think it also plays into other elements of domestic violence?
Yes, definitely. I completely agree. I think machismo has a lot to do with that because it's like, again, usually culturally we were raised in a way that men have to be strong. They don't cry
Don't cry.
because if they cry, they see crying only for women and we are weak. You know,
Wow.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
that's how it is seen. So yeah, if you cry, you're a little girl. You shouldn't be crying. So of course they don't want to be called girls. So they grow up thinking that being strong is no crying, no saying I'm hurt. This happened to me, so I just have to be quiet and strong and keep this mask that no matter what happens to me, I am the macho as machismo. So I am that macho. So I can't really, because everybody, like not just my family, but it also, of course, parents will be like, what? You know, the male figures, but also the community. Our community will be like, oh my God, you know, this guy came and said that he was being hit by his wife, or, you know, like he's being a victim of domestic violence. So it will look really weird in our community in a certain way. And I get why they wouldn't go forward and say that's why we don't see too many men coming and saying like, listen, this is happening to me when we know that it happens. It's not just women, you know. And I think definitely machismo has a lot to do with that because we are still a very machismo community and culture.
It's really interesting you say this, though, because in research that I was trying to do about this community in general, there was literally no information about male survivors of violence in the Hispanic community. I thought it was shocking. I remember I was like really looking for that perspective, and there just wasn't, at least that I could find, much information out there at all. How do you think that affects their willingness? I know you spoke about this a little bit, but how do you think that expects their willingness to come forward? What would it mean for a man to admit that they were being abused by a woman.
You hear a lot, oh, the marriages from back in the days, those lasted. Yeah, but they didn't last because, they lasted
Respect and
because
love.
because of respect and love,
Mm.
right? They lasted because people weren't speaking up, because things were normalized,
Mm.
because and I think maybe that's what's happening now with abuse towards men. And then you have the machismo effect, which is even worse, right?
Mm.
So it's gonna take a lot. It's going to take time. It's going to take people, one person coming out,
Yeah.
a next, and then an opening up, maybe a center for men, like the
Mhm.
Hispanic Women's Center, opening a center for men and making them aware that this is not okay, that it's okay, that this is a safe space for you to speak up. I think that we're maybe in the early stages, but we will eventually, I'm hopeful that we can get there. Because abuse is not okay for anyone.
For anyone.
Yeah. So there is another community question that somebody asked. One of our staff members suggested that we touch upon this concept of love and violence, and how that is sometimes socially acceptable in the Hispanic community. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Thinking of all the quotes that I hear, right, growing up. One quote that I heard that this reminded me of is, if si no te cela, no te quiere. If they don't show jealousy, or that they're jealous, then they don't love you,
Oh my
right? And so
gosh.
that's when I think of it now, I'm like, that is so toxic, right? But you grow up thinking, right? And that is like thinking that abuse, right? That toxicity, that, the jealousy, that's love, that's the way that love is expressed.
Mm.
And it's almost like, the good love, the healthy love is more of, is sometimes, or can be viewed as less love, if that makes any sense.
Why do you think that is, that there is this want for like a passionate, extreme, almost controlling, jealous love? Where do you think that stems from?
Novelas.
Oh, yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Can,
That's right. You're completely right. You just touch one really important point, is that type of information we receive in the novelas. We're always suffering, Oprah is always
wow.
suffering, and then we saw like, oh, maybe that's what it should be. But
Wow.
also, it's the way and again, I said this is not something that it has to be just now, but it's historically our transgenerational trauma,
Mm.
because our great grandmothers were, in order to control them, they tell them that I'm doing this because I love you, because I want you to, I hit you because this is a way for you to learn and to be
Whoa.
good, and but I love you, because if I didn't love you, I wouldn't do this. Like when you hit your kids, it's like, I love you, and this is a way for you to be educated, for you to be a good person. Sometimes that's how it could be seen. So if, since you're a kid, you think that it's okay, then when you get into a relation, then someone comes, hits you or yells at you, you'll be like, that's okay, because it's love. They are just showing me how I have to behave. They're showing me how I should be doing things. And I wouldn't see that as something bad, because it happened when I was a kid, so it's okay. It can happen when I'm an adult again, because this person loves me. I'm doing this to you. And we see that in novelas, in movies, and everywhere. Like, like, oh, honey, no, I didn't mean to hurt you. It's because I want you to be better, because I want. So, and then inside of you, you're like, oh, maybe I did something wrong, and this is the way I have to learn. So I think that's definitely one. And the person who asked this question, I completely agree. We see that like love and violence is something that goes together, and it's okay. Not with me anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely, like, like when you start learning about all those things, it's like you're being blind for a long time. And that happens when we
Yeah.
talk to women about this. They're like, wait, so
Mm.
yelling is not okay? No.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's very common, because for us, usually violence is just hitting. No other things, like no being dependent from someone telling you like, this is my money and you cannot use it unless I tell you. For us, that's, oh, it's okay, because he's the man. He's the
Wow.
household head, so it's okay. I don't need money if that's the case because he's the provider, you know? So, and when we tell them that's violence, they're like, what? No,
Oh my
but it's
gosh.
he's, you know, and that's shocking because it's like,
Yeah.
this is why this keeps happening and happening because
Mm.
even there is young people who come and they're like, I'll rather to stay because economically this works, and
Mm-hmm.
that's how I was raised. You know, I have to just get married, have kids, and listen.
Wow. How do you even go about deconstructing something that's so ingrained in you? I mean, to think about coming and being a victim of violence and having to be told, like, these behaviors, what's happening to you, it's not okay. Like, how does somebody even begin to process that deconstruction? It seems so difficult.
It is. It is very difficult when, again, when we tell the women like that's violence, we can see in their face the disappointment. It's like everything I learned in my entire
Wow.
life, it's not like that. It shouldn't have been. And then they start saying, oh my God, if I have known this wouldn't have happened. And this, and they start telling us different things. And it's like, but you know what? It's crazy because many of them,
Mhm.
then at the end, they still say, you know what? You're right. Now I know, but I'm not willing to change this, you know, and
Wow.
which is the sad part
Yeah.
that it's a few will actually say, yes, I'm ready no matter what, I know, but it's the
Mm.
fear of what's going to happen, you know, like I have this stability right now. It doesn't
Mm.
matter if emotionally and even physically I'm not okay, but my children and everybody in my family, it's okay. So, you know what? This is my sacrifice, you know?
And that's almost seen as noble in a way, you know? It's like,
Romantic.
yeah, romantic. Look at what I'm doing
Yeah.
for like the love of my family. Wow, that is really difficult to even begin to navigate.
It's very complex when you're working with people who have been subjected to abuse and
Mm.
having and trying to, have this conversation where you're like, that was not okay, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just that awareness of like, okay, that's not okay, that's,
Mhm.
but it's also what I've seen is that pe folks start to feel that it's a reflection of them that,
Oh.
like I allowed this. It's
Mm.
me. There's something wrong with me. How did I not know? And then I think that's why it's so critically important to have resources where you have experts, right? That are
Mhm.
able to provide guidance and therapy and
Mhm.
resources to help people cope with that. And it's challenging. It's challenging to navigate that. And it's heartbreaking to see that people feeling that it's a reflection of them and that it's
Yeah.
something wrong with them.
What would you want somebody to know that does feel that way? If you could send them a message right now, what would you say?
You are loved, and it's nothing that you did, nothing that you didn't do. It has absolutely nothing to do with you doing anything wrong.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about such an important topic. I learned so much from all of you, and I hope everyone listening recognizes why cultural identity is a vital piece of a victim's journey to safety. If you would like to learn more about the Morris County Organization for Hispanic Affairs, please visit mcoha.org. Please tune in next week to Unsilenced to learn about how Halloween costumes can promote unhealthy relationships. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.